Hello everyone and welcome to another video. If you saw the length of this video you could probably already guess, but this time we're going to do something a little different than the regularly scheduled Animal Crossing content. I wanted to celebrate reaching 20 subscribers by subjecting you all to a deep dive into the history of the internet through a queer lens. This topic is one that is very important to me, and hopefully it will become important to some of you who watch this video. When I was in high school, we had the option to do a senior project. I did mine on general queer history in the United States and called my project History Through a Queer Lens. And for a few years afterwards, I ran a blog by the same name with the same concept. I have always thought it was imperative for everyone to know the history of their community, and because of that, I have spent a very large portion of my time researching queer history and absorbing as many queer stories as I could. That brings us to today. More than just being queer, I am also someone who grew up with the internet. I, like many of you watching, am a global citizen of the World Wide Web. We are a community, so it's only natural we should get to know the history of our online community. The internet is a vast and ever-expanding space with thousands of niche communities of people brought together by a common interest or mindset. These cyber cliques have nearly always existed, and they often become safe spaces for people who are otherwise ostracized from other communities. I know at the very least that I have experienced this in my life. Growing up being one of the only kids out of the closet in my town at the time, I felt an incredible loneliness that has since been absent from my life thanks to the friends I've made in online spaces. These are people I hold in very high esteem who I can have discussions with about things that matter to each of us. But what did queer people do before they had these spaces online? Oftentimes, they would meet at gay bars or use coded words to identify each other. A popular example of this used frequently in discussion about queer history is the phrase, "a friend of Dorothy." If someone was a friend of Dorothy, they were typically stating that they were a homosexual man. In England, the queer community had a coded language called Polari, which they used to discreetly communicate with each other because homosexuality was illegal until 1967 in England and Wales. How did the internet change this? Today, we are going to explore the intersection between internet and queer history. How did one affect the other? Where did queer people gather in the early days of the internet? And what did they do during that time? In the description of this video, you'll find timestamps corresponding to each section of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and let's get into it. I'm about to give a really dumbed down explanation of how the internet works for anyone who might not know, so consider this your warning. The internet, using a very simplified definition, is a network made of networks spanning most of the planet. The word internet is a shortened form of internetwork, which really explains the basics. A network is basically a group of things being connected to one another. For example, if you tied a bunch of strings together in different ways, you would have a network of strings. Inter is a Latin root word meaning between, so an internetwork is something between networks. What is that something? Data is just information. From a technical level, the information comes in the form of bits, or binary digits, ones and zeros, etc. From a more realistic perspective, data is everything you see and hear from a computer. This video is made up of thousands upon thousands of bits. A regular tweet can contain up to 4,480 bits. The device you use to make and send that tweet takes these bits, the data, and sends them between various networks, likely your home internet network and Twitter's main network, and the data ends up being displayed and accessed by other people in different networks. It can get to be a very complicated and fast-moving process. So that's the dumbed down technical definition of the internet. But what is it for the modern consumer? Well, for most people, the internet is a group of websites and social media networks, and perhaps a few email addresses. Most people do not venture very far outside of their routine when it comes to the internet. You probably check your phone for notifications on Instagram, Snapchat maybe. If you're at work, maybe Slack. You check your emails, watch something on a streaming platform like Netflix or Hulu. If you're watching this video, you probably spend a good amount of time on YouTube. Maybe you go on Reddit for a while. Each and every person has a different bubble of networks that they tap into every day. However, the internet is so much more than that. It is truly more than a sum of its parts. At least the sum of the parts you see every day. We won't get into it for this video, but most people have heard of the deep web and the dark web. These are parts of the internet that aren't very easy to access if you're an average user. In order to browse these sections of the web, you have to have a special internet browser, and in some instances you need a certain level of security clearance. Almost every government in the world has their own private and encoded network that serves as a smaller and secure internet. Beyond that, some people use the dark web for illegal activities such as the trafficking of illicit substances or, unfortunately, people. Researching these parts of the internet can get pretty scary, so I urge you to use caution if you ever look into it. So that's the internet. That's what almost everyone uses almost every day to connect with different people and access information on a consistent and frequent basis. But there's more. This video isn't just about the internet, it's also about the queer internet. The queer internet is not a monolithic corporation or organization, it's an idea, a concept if you will. The queer internet is a personal experience, and what comprises it is up to any one individual to decide for themselves. For me, the queer internet is the idea of a group of accessible and accepting websites and social media platforms that cater to the queer community or provide a home for queer discussion and networking. The queer internet exists within the regular internet and can be found on almost every platform if you know where to look. This concept will be analyzed further later on in the video, but I figured it would be beneficial to kind of give a sneak peek into what I mean. On Twitter, for example, there is gay Twitter. It is accessed by queer people who follow mainly other queer people who also follow mainly other queer people. This tends to curate posts from all over Twitter that are made by queers for queers. There is less bigotry in these spheres of influence, as most bigots do not find their way onto these spaces purposefully or accidentally. It is a rare, time-consuming process to go from vanilla funny posts Twitter to queer Twitter. Similarly, TikTok's For You page can be curated by an individual to provide them with content created by mostly queer creators. A lot of sites that utilize similar algorithms can create room for queer communities. There are easier ways to find other queer people online. For instance, Facebook gives users the ability to create and join groups made by other users. Almost every region has their own gay or queer Facebook group. Discord, similarly, has a multitude of queer servers that anyone can join and network with other queer people. The elephant in the room, of course, is Tumblr. We're definitely going to have to do a thorough deep dive into Tumblr's role in queer online culture because its impact is very, very large. Tumblr provided a very safe bubble from the rest of the world for queer people in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It was, and sometimes still is, a place where queers could engage in discourse about their favorite characters and show off their creative projects. This seems like a very good and wholesome environment, but it was not. Tumblr brought as much good to the world as it did bad. Again, we'll get more into it later, but I could not move on without at least mentioning it, as it is a very important part of the queer internet. All of this is cool and fun information, but there's a very important and lingering question that has to be addressed before we can move any further into this deep dive. Why should you care? Why should anyone care about this information? Besides having background noise for however long this video is, what's the point? Truth is, queer history often ends at the beginning of the 21st century. People talk about the AIDS epidemic and end the discussion there, but there is so much more to uncover. 20 years ago, in 2002, queer people still existed. They didn't lie dormant from 1999 to 2015 waiting for gay marriage to be legalized in the United States. There were massive groups of queer people participating throughout the entirety of the internet. If you're straight or cisgendered and you're watching this video, I hope you'll walk away having learned something about the queer community that you previously didn't know. Educating yourself about other communities is always a good and important thing as we continue to progress as a society. If you're straight, cisgendered, and a Republican, I'm impressed you made it this far into the video, and I surely am manifesting you not leaving any hate comments on this video. Please don't. If you find yourself to be in possession of some sort of queerness, this is going to be so fun for you. You get the opportunity to learn more about our community and some fun tech history without having to even lift a finger. As I've said before, and as I'll probably say again, learning your own history is incredibly important. It gives you a new perspective on the people who came before you, or for older queers, it gives you a fun nostalgia trip. There is so much to gain from watching this and absolutely nothing to lose. That's all fine and dandy, but why am I the one giving you this information? What are my credentials beyond a high school project and the current hyperfixation on old shit? Well, beyond that, and being viciously queer, I don't have any. I'm not a history major, I don't have a fancy degree. The only difference between me and you is that I was bored enough to want to compile all of this information into a video to celebrate a milestone for my channel. That's literally it. I'm doing the best I can to correctly find, utilize, and cite my sources for this video. In the description there will be links to any websites or articles I used throughout this to demonstrate my point, but as a disclaimer, this is not an academic work. I am not qualified to talk about this, and there is always a chance I misinterpret something, but I will do what I can to avoid that entirely. That's enough of me pleading my case, let's get back to the video. Before we can properly get into the history of the internet, we have to understand the basic history of the computer. And we cannot understand the basic history of the computer without first learning about Alan Turing, a man who many consider to be the father of the modern computer. Alan Turing was a queer computer scientist and mathematician born in London, England in 1912. His parents often traveled between England and India for his father's work, and because of this, he, along with his brothers, spent a lot of time living without their parents in the care of others. He showed signs of genius very early in life, being recognized by a plethora of the adults surrounding him. He excelled in schools and formed an understanding of the complexities of science and mathematics rather quickly. At age 16, he was able to figure out and find meaning in some of Albert Einstein's works, something not many adults today would be able to do. He spent so much time and energy with science and math that his teachers worried about his success in other fields of academia. While at a boarding school, Turing befriended and eventually fell in love with his peer, Christopher Morcom. Morcom was Turing's muse, inspiring him to dive further into the depths of math and science. However, tragedy struck the pair as Morcom succumbed to tuberculosis in 1930. This obviously devastated Turing, who dealt with his grief by pouring every ounce of energy he had into his studies. In a letter addressed to Morcom's mother, Turing wrote, "I am sure I could not have found anywhere another companion so brilliant and yet so charming and unconceited. I regarded my interest in my work, and in such things as astronomy, to which he introduced me, as something to be shared with him, and I think he felt a little the same about me. I know I must put as much energy, if not as much interest, into my work as if he were alive, because that is what he would like me to do." After Morcom's death and Turing's graduation from the boarding school, he went on to attend King's College in Cambridge, where he became a fellow. Later, he attended and received a PhD in mathematics from Princeton University in New Jersey. During his time in higher education, Turing published a paper that essentially laid the framework for the modern computer, where he theorized about a universal Turing machine that could solve any algorithmic problem. The Princeton University Press noted that Turing's proof was easily the most influential math paper in history. After finishing his formal education, Alan Turing went on to work as a cryptanalyst for the United Kingdom during World War II. A cryptanalyst is someone who works to break ciphers and codes. Turing was tasked to break German ciphers. Particularly, he and his team set out to solve the German Enigma code, which had the ability to produce this many unique coded alphabets using a special machine with rotors that changed the settings to any conceivable possible code. They were successful in this mission using the bomb, which was an electric machine designed by Turing and his team. Turing continued to find ways to decode German ciphers throughout the war. After the war, in February of 1946, Turing published a paper detailing the first complete design for a stored program computer, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a computer that stores programs and data electronically rather than on a switchboard. This design is the birth of the modern computer. Without this, we would not be anywhere near where we are today when it comes to technological advancements and, of course, the internet. While Turing is very clearly an important figure in both queer and computing history, his story does not have a happy ending, and as such, I am providing you with a content warning for chemical castration, anti-LGBTQ+ laws, and a non-detailed mention of suicide. The following is an abridged excerpt from his Wikipedia article. In January 1952, Turing was 39 when he started a relationship with Arnold Murray, a 19-year-old unemployed man. Just before Christmas, Turing was walking along Manchester's Oxford Road when he met Murray just outside the Regal Cinema and invited him to lunch. On the 23rd of January, Turing's house was burgled. Murray told Turing that he and the burglar were acquainted, and Turing reported the crime to the police. During the investigation, he acknowledged a sexual relationship with Murray. Homosexual acts were criminal offenses in the United Kingdom at the time, and both men were charged with gross indecency under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. Initial committal proceedings for this trial were held on the 27th of February, during which Turing's solicitor reserved his defense, i.e., did not argue or provide evidence against the allegations. Turing was later convinced by the advice of his brother and his own solicitor, and he entered a plea of guilty. The case, Regina v. Turing and Murray, was brought to trial on the 31st of March in 1952. Turing was convicted and given a choice between imprisonment and probation. His probation would be conditional on his agreement to undergo hormonal physical changes designed to reduce libido. He accepted the option of injections of a synthetic estrogen. This feminization treatment of his body was continued for the course of 1 year. Treatment rendered Turing impotent and caused breast tissue to form, fulfilling in the literal sense Turing's prediction that no doubt I shall emerge from it all a different man, but quite who have not found out. Murray was given a conditional discharge. Turing's conviction led to the removal of his security clearance and barred him from continuing with his cryptographic consultancy for the government, though he kept his academic job. He was denied entry into the United States after his conviction in 1952, but was free to visit other European countries. Shortly thereafter, Turing committed suicide at the age of 41 in 1954. Turing was a man who contributed much to fields in math, science, and computing, and on December 24, 2013, nearly 60 years after his death, he was pardoned by Queen Elizabeth II. After Alan Turing's rather large contribution to the world of computing, things began to move at a much faster rate. This is a condensed timeline of the early history of the computer after Turing from 1953 to the year 2000. In 1953, the first computer language, COBOL, was developed by Grace Hopper. COBOL stands for Common Business-Oriented Language. Interestingly, COBOL is still used to this very day in over 70% of global business transactions. In 1958, the first computer chip, or integrated circuit, was released by Jack Kilby and Robert Noyce. This chip had very little computing power, but it led to what we have today. Kilby created the chip with Noyce while they were working at Texas Instruments. 10 years later, in 1968, Douglas Engelbart released his prototype for the first computer that resembled what we know them to be currently. His design even included a mouse and a user interface. In 1969, the same year humankind landed on the moon for the first time, Unix was born. Unix was an operating system that would make connecting networks between computers easier. Unix is the basis for Linux. Also in 1969, two computers connected for the very first time, establishing the basis for the internet we all know and love today. The very first message sent between these two computers, one at Stanford and the other at UCLA, was LO. It was supposed to say login, but unfortunately the connection crashed after only 2 letters were transmitted. In 1971, IBM invented the floppy disk. The first floppy disks held 80 kilobytes of data, which was more than enough storage back then, but for reference, you need 1,048,576 kilobytes to make a single gigabyte. Most phones today, they have either 32 or 64 gigabytes, but even some higher market phones have 512 gigabytes, which is equivalent to 536,870,912 kilobytes. During the same year as the floppy disk, email was developed by Ray Tomlinson. In 1972, the video game Pong was released and became the first successful video game. In 1973, the Ethernet cable was invented. This was also the year that held the very first transatlantic connection between computers. In 1974, the Altair was developed as the first personal computer, or PC. Only a few years later, Bill Gates would become inspired by this computer and start Microsoft. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak co-founded Apple Computer and released the Apple I, which was the first computer to use ROM. In 1977, Apple Computers Incorporated introduced the Apple II computer at the West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco. It introduced color graphics to the general public. 1978 brought us the very first spam email sent to 600 people from a guy named Gary Thuerk. In 1979, Usenet was launched and allowed people from all over the world to participate in online message boards. In 1984, the Apple Macintosh was announced through a Super Bowl ad. One of the oldest virtual communities, The Well, was started in 1985. In 1988, Internet Relay Chat, or IRC, was released, which allowed users to send instant messages to anyone in the world. AOL, or America Online, was first launched in 1989. In 1990, the World Wide Web was born, and in 1991, the very first web page was created. In 1993, Mosaic was released and was considered to be the first web browser for use by the general public. In 1994, Netscape came online. Netscape would eventually become Mozilla Firefox, one of the biggest web browsers used today. In 1995, the internet was commercialized. Both eBay and Amazon were launched in this year. In 1998, Google was born. In the year 2000, the dot-com bubble burst, resulting in the loss of billions of dollars for investors and a huge mass closure of hundreds of online companies. The internet, as you can see, has an extraordinarily rich history. But this isn't everything. In fact, it's far from it. The internet has always been queer. From day one, there have been people searching, finding, and creating their own safe spaces on the internet in order to find a community they might not have had access to in their real life. If you don't live in an urban environment, it can be extremely difficult to find any sort of queer community without finding one online. This was especially the case in the 90s and during the better part of the 2000s. In my experience, the earliest online queer community I can remember joining was a Kik group chat for LGBT youths in 2011 when I was 10 years old. Now, if you know anything about Kik's reputation with minor safety, then you know I can't go any further explaining this experience, but it was my introduction to the idea of there being queer communities online. In retrospect, I know now that I should not have been allowed to roam freely on the internet at such a young age. But there's not much that can be done about it now, and it has led to a generation-wide trauma bond between places like Kik and Omegle, a randomized chat room service where you can chat with anyone in the world through either messages or through a video call in the early 2010s. But those aren't queer spaces, and they never were. Sites like that are predatory spaces masquerading as safe spaces, and there was very little warning on the internet at the time. But that's not what this video is about. I'd gladly make a video about this later on, however. As I was saying, queer people are the internet. In fact, AOL reported that approximately 1/3 of all of its chat rooms were queer-centric spaces in the 90s. Russell Siegelman, at the time working for Microsoft, told the New York Times in 1995, "The gay community has always been one of the most active groups online." He was most certainly correct. Queer people were disproportionately more likely to be active on the internet in the 90s than any other group of people. There were hundreds, possibly thousands of queer chat rooms, forums, and websites available to the public during the early years of the commercial internet. But I don't have time to go through all of them, so I'm going to highlight what I think were the most integral to the shaping of the online queer community. OutProud was created by Chris Kreisen and nicknamed the Google for Queers. It gave resources to LGBT youths and hosted a plethora of chat rooms and forums relating to the vastness of the queer experience. It was an immensely popular service at the time of its release, but today, unfortunately, it seems to just be a network of semi-inactive blogs. Its website traffic seems to be almost non-existent. Planet Out was an electronic media company hosted through Microsoft that produced queer content online for the LGBT+ community. It was published in 1995. It was considered by many to be the gay global village of cyberspace, and it received a lot of support from celebrities, AOL, Microsoft, and almost every queer organization in the United States. It also was the owner of the website gay.com, before being sold and essentially liquidated by Here Media in 2008. Its 13-year tenure on the internet was not wasted, however, as its legacy continues on to this day, with much of the queer content on the internet being ancestors of the things created by Planned It Out. LiveJournal was launched on April 15, 1999, and quickly became a place of residence on the internet for women and queer people to interact with one another safely. It was a hub for many queer people to express their creativity, and soon it was the home of an enormous amount of fan fiction. I can't imagine anyone watching this video is unaware of what fanfiction is in the year of our Lord 2022, but, just in case, fanfiction is any work, typically a piece of writing, created by a fan of any show, movie, book, etc., that typically fits within the canon of the original content's story. Oftentimes, it can be a continuation of a story after it has ended or a retelling of the original story. For many queer people, though, fanfiction often involved two characters from the original story being portrayed in a relationship with each other or with the reader. This is called shipping, and it remains a hugely popular part of the online queer community today on websites such as Archive of Our Own or Wattpad. In 2007, LiveJournal was sold to a Russian company and remains in business and active in communities all over the world. Its terms, conditions, and bylaws are in accordance with the Russian government, however, so censorship has become an issue when it comes to queer stories and experiences being written on the site. I told you we were going to get back to Tumblr, and now here we are. Tumblr was launched in 2007 and immediately found success within the queer community. Particularly, the online trans community used Tumblr to document and share their transitions with other queer people. This continued until 2018 when Tumblr banned all NSFW content from their website, including pictures of post-op results for gender-affirming procedures for trans people. This ban also made it impossible for sex workers to promote and share their work on a platform that was previously supportive of the profession. Despite this, Tumblr still boasts that its users are 193% more likely to be queer than users on any other platform. Tumblr provided a very aesthetic home for queer people all over the world, and it streamlined the blogging process. Queer people interacted with each other more on Tumblr than ever before, and this became a breeding ground for hot takes and proclamations that may or may not be satirical. I will not be providing an example of this because some of these things lead to very damaging rhetoric for the queer community at large. The Tumblr we have today is undoubtedly different from the Tumblr of yesterday, but it still remains a home for thousands upon thousands of queer people of all ages, and for that it is an important part of queer online history. It's certainly not all bad either. People form incredibly wholesome and important friendships and relationships on Tumblr, and it can be a safe space for queer youths now that NSFW content is banned. But if you were on Tumblr between 2012 and 2015, you know what I know, and you know we can never go back. Tumblr owes me financial compensation for emotional distress. So, this has essentially been a crash course in queer internet history. Without the internet, it is uncertain what the queer community would be today. While there are troves of problematic material that one could scour through when it comes to the queer internet, it remains a net positive experience that has garnered millions of LGBT+ individuals meaningful and lasting relationships with like-minded people from all over the world. This video does not nearly scratch the surface of this topic, however, and I encourage you to do your own research into this if it interests you. In the description of this video, I have all of the resources I used linked, including Queer Digital, which is an archival website with a plethora of primary posts from queer people on the internet before the year 2010. There is so much left to unpack when it comes to this topic, and I think there may be a day where I decide to come back to this and dig deeper into everything. With that being said, I really do appreciate you watching it. It means the world to me. This topic, as I said in the beginning, is endlessly important to me, and I hope you walk away from this video feeling like it's important to you as well. This has been so much fun, but I have to end the video somewhere, so I guess I'll shut up now. We are going back to a regularly scheduled video game content after this, so get ready for that. Thank you so much for 20 subscribers, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!